Good morning. We are on day 54 of lockdown. Hope you're hanging on in there. Thank you for joining me today. We're going to be looking at the fourth gospel today, commonly known as the Gospel of John. And over the next 2 days, I'm going to try and show you some of the wonders that this extraordinary book contains. First question we're going to ask, as always, is who wrote it, and see if we can work that out. Verse 24 of the very last chapter, so in other words, almost at the very end of the book. This is the disciple who is here, who is bearing witness about these things, and who has written about these things, and we know that his testimony is true. And these things refers to a conversation about and between, about the disciple whom Jesus loved, verse 20. So it's the disciple whom Jesus loved is the one who is claiming authorship of this gospel. Now, who is the disciple that Jesus loved? Widely thought to be referring to John, son of Zebedee, largely because otherwise this very prominent figure in Jesus's 12 is not mentioned in the gospel. So we encounter the other major disciples, probably all of them are named somewhere, I haven't checked, but John isn't named except for this shadowy figure called the disciple that Jesus loved. So this is almost certainly referring to John, son of Zebedee, as in James and John, one of the pair, and it seems to be the name of the author of the gospel. That's the internal evidence. The external evidence is that the early church traditions, as we've seen with the other gospels, very, very early, they believed that this was written by John, the fisherman, John, son of Zebedee. And so I'm going to go with that for the purposes of this discussion, although it is a debated question. So the classic case of the authorship, just to mention that briefly, is that the author appears to be deeply embedded in Jewish thought. He uses rabbinic styles of writing. He describes himself as an eyewitness, not just here, but in chapter 1, verse 14 and chapter 19, verse 35. Let's look up 1935. I'm going to come to the other one later on, or maybe tomorrow. But let's look up 1935 now, shall we? And it says this. This is at the death of Jesus, when the soldier pierces Jesus' side. He who saw it has borne witness. His testimony is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth, that you also may believe. Now, in terms of that's further internal evidence, actually, that this is John, because John is the only disciple that we have, the only male disciple that we have clear evidence of being at the cross. Now, John's Gospel, if you've read the Gospels at all, you will almost certainly have noticed that John's Gospel is hugely different in style from the synoptics, that's the other three Gospels. It has different stories, it has different emphases, and it's just written in a very, very different way. However, to begin with, the first thing we should say really about this is that it has very many points of similarity, and many important points of similarity. So, for example, points of similarity, this is not an exhaustive list. All the Gospels speak of John the Baptist. John and I think all the synoptics refer to the feeding of the 5,000. John agrees with the others about Jesus' voyage with his disciples on the Sea of Galilee. Peter's confession of faith is found in John as well as the synoptics. The triumphal entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. Jesus' remarkable claims concerning his own identity, his acts of power, the developing opposition and hostility of the Jewish leaders, the cleansing of the temple, although John puts it in a different place in the gospel, and this is further indication to us that the gospel writers organised their work at least partly by theme, and in order to make particular theological points rather than worrying too much about chronology. Now, we could overstate that, but nonetheless chronology is not their main concern, I think. So cleansing of the temple is one of the ones that they have in common. The fact that Jesus had a final meal with his disciples is in common between John and the synoptics, although John emphasises different elements of that meal, and I'll talk about that in a minute. All four Gospels, of course, testify to the trial, the condemnation and the crucifixion of Jesus and his resurrection from the dead on the third day. And John, like the others, has, well, like Matthew and Luke, has resurrection appearances and the commissioning of his disciples. And there are also many, many specific sayings that are held in common between them, or themes that are found in common between all four Gospels. So what are the distinctions? What are the things that John does differently? Well, there's certain things he doesn't have in his Gospel, and I'll give you a kind of an abbreviated list of those things in just a moment. But it's worth reflecting on why that might be. Now, John's Gospel is widely thought to have been written a little later, and again, how much later depends on who you think wrote it. But John the disciple lived for a long while. Unlike Peter, who died, who was executed, and others, James, John's brother, who was executed very early in the expansion of the church. So John lived to be an old man, and so that partly explains why his Gospel, or how his Gospel can be written considerably later and yet still have him as the author, if that makes sense. So if we think that John's Gospel seems to be leaving out certain things that we might think very important, and we think, well, did John not consider them important? Well, one way of understanding that question is to think, well, John already is aware of the circulating Gospels of Matthew, Mark and Luke, and so he doesn't feel the need to reiterate every point that they make, but he has his own particular things that he wants to show. So he's supplying his Gospel as a supplement, if you like, to the ones that are in existence. This is supposition, this is conjecture. We don't know these things for sure, but it seems to make sense. So what does John not have? Well, John doesn't have any parable sayings of Jesus. He doesn't, I think, have any healing of demoniacs, of demon-possessed people, which the synoptics refer to on quite a number of occasions. He doesn't show us the transfiguration. He shows us the Last Supper, but he doesn't show us the institution of the Lord's Supper, the breaking of bread and wine, and the symbolism that carries. He shows us the Garden of Gethsemane, but here too he shows us something different happening, not contradictory, but different elements of what is taking place in the garden, and we eavesdrop on Jesus's prayer in more detail than the synoptics show us, but we don't see Jesus's agony as the synoptics do. Where am I? Lost my place briefly. Okay, so those are some of the things that John doesn't have. What does he have? Well, he focuses his Gospel much more on what takes place in Jerusalem. So Jesus makes a number of visits to Jerusalem during his ministry. And he seems to come up for the major feasts, or at least for some of the major feasts. And so John organises his material quite a lot around those major feast events, partly in order to pull in some of the theology that those feasts are saying about Jesus and the way Jesus pulls that theology out himself, and partly because this is where a lot of the discussion and debate is happening in and around the temple with the Jewish leaders. Things that John gives us that the synoptics don't. The wedding at Cana in Galilee, where Jesus turns water into wine. Wonderful story, and only John tells us that. The conversations with Nicodemus. This is, of course, the place where Jesus says, you must be born again, and where Jesus says, God so loved the world, God so loved the world, he sent his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. Perhaps the best known verse in the Bible, and that's found in the Nicodemus discourse. The conversation with the Samaritan woman, where Jesus promises to give her living water. The raising of Lazarus, and the prolonged farewell discourses, which in John's Gospel last 4 chapters. Only John has these. Also the foot washing of his disciples at the Last Supper. How does John present his material? He presents his material quite differently from the others. He presents his material with a number of signs and discourses. I'll show you that in a minute. He uses these extended discourses, whereas the synoptics tend to They do collect sayings of Jesus. So, for example, the Sermon on the Mount would be a very good example of a collection of the sayings of Jesus. But they're not sort of prolonged discourses in the way that John has them, where Jesus kind of debates and talks at length and quite discursively sometimes about particular themes. And the way that Jesus is speaking here is a typical rabbinic method of argument, and we see that from other literature from this period. Other Jewish literature from this period. So John is showing us a very authentic side of the way Jesus's ministry would have been, but it's a different side from some of the things that the synoptics show us. Not contradictory, but complementary. I've mentioned briefly that the chronology of John seems to be different from the synoptics, and I've said a little bit about why that might be. One of the places where the chronology is different, and this is quite interesting and causes quite a lot of speculation in this scholarly literature, is the dating of the crucifixion, or the positioning of the crucifixion with regard to the Passover. So the synoptics imply that the Passover meal was the Last Supper, so that Jesus and his disciples are gathering in the upper room to celebrate the Passover. But John puts the crucifixion of Jesus as taking place when the Passover lambs are being slaughtered, which will put it, I think, on the eve of the Passover. So now what's going on here, and does it matter? Well, one, perhaps the most simple explanation is to say that that the gospel writers are making different points. And they are organising their material in chronological terms slightly differently in order to make different points. So the positioning of the Last Supper with Passover, which the synoptics do, draws out links between the Exodus motif, the Moses who brings his people by the power of God out of slavery into freedom, and all the symbolism that is incorporated then within the Passover meal, which Jesus is taking and deepening and extending and using to point to himself. So that's perhaps what the synoptic writers are wanting to do with the Passover idea. What John is wanting to do with the Passover idea, I think, is he is showing us that so by means of, sorry, let me backtrack slightly. In the Exodus story, it is the slaughtering of the Passover lamb and the blood that is then put around the doorway of the house that averts evil, that keeps the people safe from the judgment of God, if you like. And so John, putting his dating of the death of Jesus at the same time as the Passover lambs are being killed, is drawing theological connection between Jesus and the Passover lamb. So it's not that one is right and one is the other in theological terms, it's that this Exodus event is so theologically rich that there are many strands in that Christians believe point to Jesus, and the different gospel traditions show us more than one element of that those rich strands. I hope that makes sense. Another explanation, which is not contradictory to that theological explanation, it's a kind of more pragmatic one, which is that there were differences in opinion among the different Jewish sects of the day, and they followed slightly different calendars. So there was a solar calendar, a calendar that fixed the Passover to the sun, and there was another that fixed the Passover to particular phases of the moon. I'm slightly oversimplifying that, but I don't think the details matter too much. And by those two different calendars, the Passover would sit slightly differently on any particular year. And so it may well be that both the Gospel writers are correctly identifying how the Passover chronologically links with the events of Holy Week. Because there were different Passovers being celebrated, or Passovers are being celebrated at slightly different times that week by different Jews. I think we can be confident that that is the case in terms of the lunar and solar calendars. How much that influences the decision of the Gospel writers, I think, is more conjecture. Hope that makes a little bit of sense. If it didn't, then really it's not terrifically important. So just move on. Now, why was this Gospel written? Well, our author tells us why the Gospel is written in chapter 20, verse 31. So this is almost, it's almost like there's kind of two endings to the gospel, and it feels like the writer is wrapping up at the end of chapter 20 and then kind of picks it up again, almost with an appendix in 21. So chapter 20, verse 30. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So much richness, even in that one verse. This language of so you may believe can be translated and understood in two slightly different ways. One is to understand it as so that you may come to believe. So in other words, it was written as a kind of evangelistic tract or something, evangelistic piece of writing to help people to come to believe in Jesus. And the other way of translating this is to understand it as so that you may continue to believe, so that you may hold fast in your faith. Now, obviously, I think both of those are true, and the Gospel of John has brought many people to faith over the centuries and also has held many Christians fast in their faith. So it has done both of those things, which was in the intention of the writer, or both maybe at the same time. Who knows? But it gives us a clue. The second half of the clue, of course, is that believing is not an end in itself so much as by believing you may have life in his name. And life, and the life that Jesus gives, is one of the many big important themes in John's Gospel. Right. So we've talked about the authorship. We've talked a little bit about how it relates to the synoptics. We've talked a bit about who wrote it and why it was written. Let me just say a little bit about the dating, which I've touched on briefly. Now, the fall of Jerusalem, I've said this in previous days, the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple was such a catastrophic event. This is the AD 70, the Roman destruction of the temple I'm talking about. It was such a catastrophic event in the life of the people. It was a personal tragedy for many. It was a political disaster. It was a theological catastrophe. It was such an important event that it will make its way into any serious piece of writing that is dated around those years. And there is no sign of it in this gospel. Now that means it's one of two things, really. It either means it predates the fall of Jerusalem, or it postdates it considerably so that it's kind of, the dust has settled, as it were. So in other words, this gospel will not have been written, I think, in AD 71 or AD 75 or AD 80. You know, it could have been written. Some people would argue it's written in the middle of the second century. 140, 150 or something. Although obviously, if that's the case, it hasn't been written by John the disciple. I favour an earlier date, and I think that a dating of the 60s again, perhaps the later 60s, might make sense. But we aren't quite clear. Oh, there is one piece of internal evidence actually to point out to you, that in chapter 5, verse 2, so Jesus is up in Jerusalem, and it speaks about the pool of Bethesda. I'll just read that to you. It says, chapter 5, verse 2, now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool called Bethesda or Bethsaida. And it's spoken in the present. It's written in the present tense. Greek, unlike Hebrew, marks its tenses very clearly. And the writer says, now there is in Jerusalem a pool called Bethesda, which suggests that at the time of writing that is still in existence. It's not conclusive proof, but it helps me to be more confident that this is an early date, which would fit in with what I've been saying about the authorship too. Let me just say one more thing, I think, about the Gospel today, and then I'm going to pick up on some of the wonderful themes that it contains tomorrow. Some really wonderful stuff. I can't wait to show you that. But let me just say one thing about some of the language which John uses, which can make us quite uncomfortable. And he talks a lot about the Jews. And the Jews are generally not characterised in a very positive way in this Gospel. Now, this sits uncomfortably with many of us. I hope most of us actually in our generation, because obviously we read this after thousands of years of anti-Semitism, and we read this after the Shoah, the Holocaust. We read this after many other catastrophic, dreadful moments in I have to say Christian history of anti-Semitism. And so when we read John's Gospel and John talking about the Jews in a slightly derogatory way, it feels really uncomfortable to us. And we should feel uncomfortable, but we shouldn't believe that this is the intention of the writer, I think. Now, at the time of writing, Christianity was a Jewish sect. In other words, Christianity, obviously, it emerges within Judaism. And there are, in fact, I've referred to it already today, there are a number of sects within Judaism at this time in history. Some we know quite a lot about, like the Essenes, for example, and some we know very little about. We just know that they existed. And in the early decades of the church, Christianity was firmly located within Judaism and was regarded as one sect among many. And so we see, for example, the early Christians continuing to worship at the temple and so on. And now gradually over time, Christianity and Judaism, they start to drift apart. I hope Christianity has never, it should never anyway, have forgotten its Jewish roots. But they start to drift apart and become, regarded as two different faiths, really, which have huge elements in common, but also are different faiths, different world faiths. But in these early years, Christianity is part of Judaism, and so John is not writing as a Gentile Christian in a different faith about those Jews. That's not the tone of what he's doing at all. He is writing within Judaism, and as somebody who is a passionate Jew as well as a passionate follower of Jesus Christ, and sees no conflict between those things. And so when he uses the language of the Jews, he's generally speaking about the Jewish leaders and those who don't believe in Christ. Is his kind of designation for those who haven't put their faith in Jesus Christ. But there is no sense of this being it's slightly critical in the sense that it is that they haven't put their faith in Jesus, and he thinks they should have done. But it's not derogatory. It's not intended to be anti-Semitic. Such an idea would never be further from his mind, because he himself is a Jew and regards himself as a true Jew and a devout Jew. So when we read this, we do need to be careful how we interpret it. We need to be careful how we use it in the churches sometimes, and how we express it. But we shouldn't imagine that there is anti-Semitism within this gospel. I think that is unfair to read that backwards into that. I hope that makes sense and maybe settles a little bit of anxiety that sometimes we can feel when we read this gospel. It would be a shame to approach this gospel with anxiety, or to abandon it altogether, which would be even worse, because of this language. So thank you for sticking with me through perhaps some of the drier parts of what I wanted to say, but tomorrow I'm going to show you some of the really exciting things that this gospel contains. Tune in tomorrow for the next instalment.